This is a big initiative between the SAEM and ACEP ultrasound and ultrasound research and ultrasound education subcommittees. And what we want to do is want to create a safe space for people to talk about the literature and then down the line to talk about their own research projects within emergency ultrasound. As a first session, we want to welcome all of our new fellows. You all are one of the most resilient fellowship classes I think we've had in a really long time. You've spent half of your residency training within a strange pandemic environment where you couldn't see your friends. And you are also one of the most competitive residency matches, second class to match through the SCUF pathway. And I think one of the things that I noticed in interviewing this year is just how high the caliber of your scholarly ideas has been, and the kinds of questions that you've been asking really go beyond kind of what we've done in emergency ultrasound research for a long time, which is how good is ultrasound at detecting, pathology blank, but really starting to ask questions about how to integrate this into clinical practice and how it will impact care of patients. And so really the goal of today's session is for you all to keep that fire going and to really see a few big people in the field who have done similar things and be inspired by what they have to say and not intimidated by their towering careers. So with that said, what I'm going to do, the way we're going to run this session is I'm going to introduce each panelist individually and give them some time to tell us about their career paths and how they got to where they are now. And then we'll open up to let you ask some questions while I guide some of the things that we really want to cover in this session. This session is totally different from all our subsequent sessions. The next session is going to be on trauma and EFAST ultrasound. And we have a study that we will share with you at the end of this hour. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Brooke Lerner. Dr. Brooke Lerner is the Vice Chair of Research and heads the Research Division in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Buffalo. She's also a paramedic, and her work in pre-hospital research really laid the foundation to a lot of EMS trauma and triage guidelines. So Dr. Lerner, can you tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are now and what strange ways your career has evolved in during these years?
Sure. So I think my path is probably a little bit different than all of you. I started out wanting to go to medical school, and so I became an EMT and worked in the city of Buffalo, and then thought I could make my application better by getting involved in a research program. Here, actually, in the department I'm in now, as a research assistant for the summer medical school program, and basically became really obsessed with how I was supposed to know where to take my patients. I was constantly getting yelled at for taking patients to the wrong place or doing the wrong thing, and always felt like I didn't quite know. Things are much better now than they were. This was a long time ago. But, and so I started to work with some of the faculty here in Buffalo to ask those questions in a systematic way and start to get answers for it. And I just thought it was so cool that I kind of just changed everything and decided instead to get a degree in epidemiology, focus on injury as my target, continue to work as a research assistant so I could practice what I was doing, and graduated with a PhD in epidemiology, and just continued to pursue how to make emergency medical services the best they could be. And so I guess the one thing I can say is I just found something I had a lot of passion for. And I think that's really the key to research, is that if you don't love it, it's a drag. And so you have to want to get out of bed in the morning to do it, or you won't do it. And I think being prepared to kind of put in that effort is the other part of it, that there is support, and it's definitely better now within departments to kind of help people do research and get things done, but it's still a lot of you that you really need to invest. And so I think the other part of that is part of being a researcher is being prepared for people to tell you no, like on a regular basis. And so I once read where somebody wished, and I definitely have this wish, that they had kept a rejection CV, because I think, like you said, that, I don't think it's true that we stand on a tower, but, when you look at my CV, what you don't see is that it would be 6 times longer with the rejections that I've received and the pivots I've had to make. And I think that's the beauty of emergency medicine. It is kind of all about the pivot. When something gets in your way, you change course. And I think that's a lot about how to be successful, is that people can say no and I get sad. But pretty much what I think about is, what do I do to get around whatever this no is? And people in my apartment will tell you sometimes it's annoying. But I think those are really the key things for how to chart yourself forward, is find what you love and really dedicate yourself to it, and accept that not everybody's going to love it as much as you are. And they might say no to you sometimes, but it doesn't mean you can't get around them.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for those words. I really like that idea of a rejection CV. I want to pivot a little bit to Dr. Gottlieb, who really juggles a lot of hats. He's the director of emergency ultrasound and the ultrasound fellowship director at Rush University. He's authored 300 peer-reviewed publications. He's an editor for 5 Journal, and he heads a bunch of national subcommittees that try to bring this to the forefront, issues of ultrasound, but also of ultrasound education and research, including chairing this ACEP Ultrasound Research Subcommittee that's really behind this session and has really helped us organize this session. Dr. Gottlieb, tell us about how your career evolved to include so many different things and how you keep track of all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll first of all echo Dr. Lerner's points that are huge, which is we always see like the end point in someone else, but I have a massive CV of projections that well outlays my current CV of successes. And it's just you find your passion projects to carry them forward. For me, I actually started a very different pathway. I started off residency, not at all interested in ultrasound. I thought I was going to be my mindset was, all right, I'm going to be an airway person. Airway is the absolute best thing in the world. I got really excited by airway, and I was going to be the airway person and do all the airway research. And then as I went forward, I was like, I don't know. Then I liked MSK. And I was like, I love reduction. I want to become the MSK person. So I went through this iteration of being the MSK person. And then I found ultrasound, and I actually found it kind of almost backwards, where I was trying to find some type of an airway project. And my mentor and longtime friend, John Balitz, was like, how about if we assess it with, endotracheal tube with ultrasound? I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So I went ahead and I searched into that. And that was my first real study I did. And I kind of fell my way through ultrasound that way. And then I, of course, fell in love with ultrasound because why not? It's the greatest thing ever. But I didn't really plan to go into ultrasound. In fact, I went through years of residency, not at all in the mindset of going to ultrasound. And then when I found it, I said, well, I still like airway and I still like MSK. So rather than abandoning them, I carried them forward and I found ways to try to combine them together. And I think that's one thing that has served me well, is if you like things, figure out how you can combine those efforts together. So it's not these disparate projects, but rather I like airway and I like ultrasound. So I'll do some studies looking at intubation. I like MSK and I like ultrasound. So I'll look at dislocation reduction and diagnostic accuracy. I like medical education and I like ultrasound. So I'm going to look at the integration and how they can be used to become better facilitators of ultrasound education, how we can better study this. So a lot of the projects I do, I try to streamline them together so they align interests rather than letting them be individual disparate projects. That said, sometimes something's just really fun and it's totally unrelated to ultrasound. And I think that's okay too. I think we have to be okay to have those side projects that don't necessarily align with it. It's something that you're really passionate about. Again, calling back to Dr. Lerner's point, you have to be passionate about it. If you like it, that's okay, as long as you have a clear forward trajectory. So I think that was kind of one of my biggest lessons, is figure out your forward trajectory, try to align them as best as possible. The other area is just explore different avenues. I started off doing, randomized controlled trials. Then I started to learn systematic reviews, and I like that methodology. Then I started to learn survey research. And each time along the way, I figured out how I could draw it back there. So a study can now be applied across, for example, when we did randomized controlled trials on ultrasound for intubation, we did subsequent studies looking at systematic reviews of this. And we can do survey studies, and we can do different types of modalities. You can even use qualitative to figure out why people are not actually using this in practice. And so we can take the same idea and actually approach from different lenses and keep your same trajectory forward. And I think there's some value in learning the different methodologies, seeing which one aligns with things you like to do, and then utilizing it together, really a full understanding or as best as we can of an individual topic.
Sounds great. I think we have some themes emerging, which is to love what you do, and also have it integrate with what all the other things that you need to do are, whether it's education or ultrasound or whatever it is that you're doing. One person who does a lot of this kind of thing is Dr. Cray Bolger, who I would like to introduce next. She is the Associate Director of Emergency Ultrasound and Ultrasound Fellowship Director at The Ohio State University. She co-hosts the Ultrasound Gel podcast with Dr. Prats, who we'll be hearing from a little bit later. She has a lot of roles, and she's trained and mentored a wide range of learners, including paramedics and medical students, residents, and fellows over the years. I'd really love to hear from her about how she got to this place and what all of that mentorship means to her.
Hopefully my Wi-Fi is okay. As you can tell, this is not my backyard. I wish it was, but from vacation here. So I kind of similarly did not have a straight path. It was a windy path. I was going to go into the community, and then I was subsequently going to do, I think, every fellowship except for talks offered in emergency medicine at one point or another, and actually came into ultrasound kind of right as fellowships were taking off. So I actually did not do an ultrasound fellowship and kind of fell in love with education. And I was not maybe as focused as Dr. Gottlieb in the fact that I kind of, if you look at my CV in the beginning, it was all over the place. And until I had to present my first dossier, I just dabbled like a true non-focused ER doctor does. And eventually found that like the unifying factor for me was education. And I love doing education research and finding ways to do it better, not just the, we did it and they liked it, which now you really can't get published very easily, but more of like, what are the impacts we're making on our learners and how can we prove that? Like all of us who have taught ultrasound or even learned ultrasound know it makes things easier and better and faster, but how do you prove that concept? And like Dr. Lerner, I don't take no well. My hospital administration will tell you that I'm like the toddler at the hospital. It's like no but. Like there are no boundaries. I will find the like crack in the door and I will sneak out. And I think that's just really important is like a lot of what we do is still new in the field of medicine and it's still foreign outside of emergency medicine. And that's become a big area of passion of mine in the last few years is like opening that Pandora's box of ultrasound to other people, whether it's pre-hospital crews, family medicine, internal medicine. I find that to be one of the most gratifying things. And so we've recently expanded our fellowship to include non-emergency medicine and really with a focused curriculum that isn't like, come join our emergency medicine ultrasound fellowship curriculum, but no, here's yours to take back to your people that's applicable to you. And trying to establish some standards there because there really aren't any. Like we are really fortunate that we have so much structure. And so watching them, you know, show up at these hospital committees like your former mentees and, you know, now one of my favorite mentees from many years ago is now a GI fellow and she is like, we are going to be better and we are going to do more. And so she's like sitting on these committees and it's just so cool to see her from her first year of medical school come all the way through. And I think having fun with what you're doing. Not just enjoying it, but like a lot of what I've done with Rachel Liu has been gaming and taking that all over the world and like, let's play games and learn. Like I am in many ways still a toddler. And so I have to have a laugh and enjoy what I'm doing every day or I'm not going to show up. Like that's why I'm happy to do this on vacation, right? It's like, I love this that much. And I think that's really important to sustainability. I'm a second generation ER doc, so I've seen what non-sustainable looks like. And I have made it my passion to help my mentees and myself have a sustainable career. And that means loving it and having fun with it.
Hey. Okay. Can you guys hear me? Cool. All right. So we have some themes, love what you do, to combine it with things that you need to do anyway, and then to keep playing. The next person that I'd like to introduce is Dr. Borikia. Dr. Kia is the Director for Clinical Trials in my own Department of Emergency Medicine at OHSU. And she, during the COVID-19 pandemic, really led an extraordinary effort in our department to continue research in this like ridiculously unstable, unclear, and undifferentiated time. She just secured her first R1 grant to evaluate the role of the electronic health record and clinical decision-making for stroke prophylaxis and AFib. I'm hoping she can tell us a little bit how she got to that point.
Yeah, so I am more of like an EM doc in my research where I have studied a lot of different things. I am interested in a lot of different things, and I will say that I started in genetics research, went to IVF research, went to chest imaging and blunt trauma. And a lot of this is based on my interest as well as alignment of opportunity. So I also look at funding opportunity and my surrounding mentorship, as well as possible colleagues who can help me make or produce successful research as well as grants. At OHSU, it ended up becoming atrial fibrillation, and that has been my primary area of research for the majority of my research funding for federal grants. And it started out with like the initial chart reviews, which is much more simpler. And then it became more into large databases from Medicare data, and then to Kaiser with their integrated health data, health system, more opportunities for clinical data, which is a great opportunity if you can ever get into Kaiser data sets. Also integrating qualitative research, and all of those combined allowed me to have the foundation to build on my R01 for a step wedge clinical trial now. So I think a lot of the things that you do in your background, like or past research, you can pull in methodology or experiences that can build up to a bigger project or a future grant. And during these time periods, I didn't just focus on any single AFib study. I was doing a lot of other things too. I was always trying to think ahead. Everyone talks about you're going to have a funding gap between these big federal grants. So I was very anxious and worried about these gaps. So I started thinking about how can I build a little nest, a little egg for that gap. So I started doing some industry studies, diversified my funding potentials to foundation grants as well. I looked into biomarker studies, ED/HIV screening studies, because we didn't have that program yet at an RED. So it was an opportunity to add a little bit of funding for myself and get OHSU emergency department in line with current guidelines as well. Did some sepsis work as well. And then I created my own role to make myself have more sustainability at OHSU and kind of have other people come to me for clinical trials. So I created that role, Director of Clinical Trials. There wasn't one yet at OHSU. It's like, why not? So I made myself, what tasks am I gonna do to make this role sound amazing? It didn't come with funding, but that's how I got connected with other people. And during COVID, everyone said, oh, there's a Director of Clinical Trials. So they came to me and asked me to help them with research. And so during COVID, I did so many different types of studies, from paper bags for reuse of PPE, testing out, is there COVID still on the paper bags, to healthcare studies, survey studies, to C3PO, which was the convalescent plasma study that Siren Network was doing, and helped with an AstraZeneca vaccine study, which still is infamous at this point as one of the COVID vaccines. And then I tried to put in my hand in one of the long COVID studies grants that NIH had put out. That was a 3-week turnaround grant proposal that we put together with other Siren folks. We didn't get it, but it was a great opportunity just to try something new and to see what it was like to put in an enormous grant that had no funding limit. We just kept adding things to that grant. Oh, that sounds like a great idea. Let's do that too. And we didn't get that grant, but it allowed me to have a new network of people that I can connect with for future studies. And I think that is really important when you can show that you are invested in something and you can put out good work. There's an opportunity for a future relationship, for a new study in the future. And that's how you kind of persevere through those funding times when you also have a gap, because someone else is going to reach out to you, or you can reach out to them for a future opportunity. And I would keep all of those people you've worked with in the past in mind as you go forward, trying to do new things. I don't do a lot of actually, I do no ultrasound research. I mentor someone who does ultrasound research, who are also future potential colleagues, right? Your mentees are all potential colleagues in the future. So yeah, that's my story.
Thanks, Lori. Yeah, I really like that idea of creating your own opportunities. And if I were to use a cliche, I think the stories that I'm hearing are really all about how this is not a sprint. It's really a marathon of trying to get to those, knowing where you're going, right? You don't have to know immediately where you're going, but it sounds like some idea of where you're going is really important. The next speaker I'd like to introduce is Dr. Pavitra Kotini Shah, who's the director of ultrasound research of the University of Chicago. And she's also a K Career Development Scholar in the NIH Building Interdisciplinary Research Careers in Women's Health Programs. She is an ultrasound person, but I would say that her work focuses not just on ultrasound, but of care of patients with cardiac emergencies in general, and really sex and gender differences within that field. Tell us a little bit about how you got to that place of where you are now as a K scholar, but also about how to combine these ultrasound and non-ultrasound interests.
Okay, I will try my best. Thank you, first of all, for having me at this forum. It's awesome. I think we truly are at the brink of an explosion of all things ultrasound related, especially with this largest group of fellows in history, I believe, of ultrasound training and education. So I think this forum is really well positioned on this journal. I mean, this Journal Club series is well positioned to kind of ignite this momentum. So happy to be here. So I'm 5 years into my role as ultrasound faculty. So kind of wanted to walk you guys through my trajectory. So I finished my fellowship, or I started my fellowship in ultrasound and resuscitation in 2014, which took me through 2016. And so that was unique already to begin with, because ultrasound fellowship is typically 1 year. And so I had added this extra year on and gave me some time to really build some relationships and kind of add to my academic portfolio a little bit. And I didn't feel as rushed. So after that, I joined the faculty here at University of Illinois at Chicago. And the following year, to Dr. Krieger's point, regarding the rejection CV, I had applied for 3 grants and was not successful in any of them. Towards the end of the year, I applied for a 4th one, which was an internal career development award. And I did manage to successfully acquire that, but I also was pregnant. So I started 2018, which was the hardest year of my life, I would say, with a newborn, and had to put a hold on this career development award. And then life happened. I have another older son who was very sick and needed open heart surgery. So, and I mentioned this because I think those life experiences kind of brought me to really start to introspect. And I would say that's one of my biggest key points I wanted to make today, as you guys are at the early point of your fellowship training, is to take some time to like really evaluate, whether it's free writing, whatever it is, journaling, to kind of get at what do you want in the next year? What do you want in the next 3 years, 5 years? Where do you see yourself in the short term or medium term? So, so that definitely affected my academic productivity. I was pretty much out for like half the year. But because I had gotten the career development award, when I did get back, it was pretty awesome. I kind of got my feet, jumped right in. I had a mentorship team that helped me kind of think through what projects I was going to work on. And And interestingly, that year, all of the fellowship projects I had been working on finally came to fruition. So literally 2 years later, finally had these as publications. And so that was a nice thing. And it can be frustrating at times, sometimes with research and ultrasound research, and specifically, it can be slow going, and it can be frustrating how kind of the pace is. But when, if you can hang on to it, it's a nice reward at the end. So that took me through end of 2018. 2019, I kind of ramped up my productivity. I was really always focused on two realms, trying to create my niche in ultrasound and resuscitation, always trying to kind of combine the two. And that year was one critical element in my training that was important was the ARMED training course that I took. And to this day, I think that ARMED course was so critical. Even that first early junior faculty development kickoff course that was at the beginning of SAEM, it was one of the best kind of motivating kind of forums that I had attended, and I still refer back to my notes from that course. So I really recommend anyone who's considering research to try to apply for that. I think application deadlines are due at the end of this month, so there's still time. And that really helped me as a junior researcher kind of gain some skills and knowledge. And one of the mentors that I was assigned through that program is who I am about working on submitting R21 grant with as a co-PI. So that was very fruitful. 2020 was pretty much a wash, just like for most of us, I would say. I mean, life really got tough with just the logistics of childcare, home life, and being in a two-position family. And then we're here at 2021 trying to pick up the pace and focus back on ultrasound and research and resuscitation. My other big take home, I think, tip would be to kind of at this stage in your career to piggyback on the giants that have gone before you, right? So what ongoing grant applications are your colleagues putting in? Can you add an ultrasound component to their aims through their sub-aims? Are there like your education colleagues? Are they doing a QI project that you can add an aspect of ultrasound education to? So those are the ways I think you can collaborate with some of your colleagues and make your time really efficient. And I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I like this idea of carving out your niche and getting the right mentorship to do that. I think is really important. I'd love to touch on that in a few minutes. But first, last but certainly not least, to introduce Dr. Mike Prats, who's the Director of Ultrasound Research at Ohio State, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Ultrasound Gel podcast that reviews recent articles in point-of-care ultrasound, who's really carved out that niche for himself in an amazing way that's benefited all of us here. Can you tell us a little bit about how that niche came to be and how you created that?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. And I'm really humbled to be in the presence of such awesome researchers here. I have a little bit of a different story and kind of a different career path, I think. I started off fellowship, I guess I should say in residency is when I really became enamored with like podcasts and social media and learning through different media. And I knew in fellowship that I really wanted to tap into that somehow. And if I could become a creator of some of the foam ed movement. And fortunately, as Dr. Bolger shared with you, she is pretty talented at mentorship. And she was definitely a great mentor to me and encouraged me in this during fellowship. And it just happened to be at the right place at the right time, because this was, as you will recall, the great rebranding of evidence-based medicine, as if like before that we didn't practice based on evidence, but suddenly there was like this big explosion where everyone was like, now we're going to call it EBM and it's going to be the right thing to do. So it was at that time, in combination with this really explosive burst of podcasting, that inspired me to try to put out an ultrasound podcast based on research. And part of that is because it's pretty hard to talk about ultrasound with purely audio. So I wanted to particularly dive into the research and the evidence behind the ultrasounds that we know and love. So I started the podcast along with Dr. Bolger and Dr. Jacob Avila, and it was just so much fun. And I realized like that is what brought out my passion. When we talk about the, finding something that you love to do, I just really love every aspect of teaching over social media, learning over social media, audio, podcasting, everything like that. And especially, I really love diving into research articles. So I found out that what drives me in this is curiosity, because I'm sure that almost everyone in medicine, having a scientific type mind, are curious about certain things. And so I'm sure you can relate, but I just really love to tackle like those questions and to see other people tackle those questions of like, how accurate is something, or what will happen if we do this, or what are the, what's the way that we can impact our patient care the most. So through exploring that, and I think trying to break down the knowledge translation, I was able to make this podcast, and it really brought with it a lot of opportunity and connections through social media and through other ways of seeing people in that world. And it's been really exciting and fun for me. I think one thing that we didn't talk about much yet is how social media interacts with research. Now a lot of publications are linked to their social media impact as well. And it's really fascinating to me why some publications may get really heavily endorsed and others may be kind of like swept under the rug. And there's an interesting science behind that. But I think overall, I'm a big believer that social media can help decrease the time of knowledge translation from when the research is performed to when actually people know about it, and when then practice changes as a result, if that's appropriate. So right now, I think I am really, I do a lot of the research, ultrasound research at OSU, and help organize that. And we have a very robust student body that's very interested in research. So we have an undergraduate ultrasound research interest group that I help run, and there's just a really great group of students that are really gung-ho about trying to do some projects. And it's just a lot of fun trying to put those pieces together and help work on educational projects and clinical projects and social media projects. So there's a lot of great intersections there, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Thank you. Great. Okay. So there's a few things that I really wanted to get to in terms of kind of giving our fellows some inspiration, some background on how to do things or how not to do things. And one of those things is really understanding how to critically read the literature and how to evaluate this mountain of information. Because even with social media, I think there's still a very large mountain of information. It's like a second mountain that you have to deal with. And so I was hoping to start with how to manage that and how to read a paper, how to select the papers that are important. And, to me, that dovetails really into how you ask your own questions, because you can't ask your own questions until you know what's already out there. And so maybe if Dr. Bolger and Dr. Prats, if you could comment maybe in parallel a little bit about how you deal with this mountain and then select this nugget that you're going to present that month or that every couple of weeks. That would be helpful.
Well, I can start because I think that you already mentioned something that's super important, because you don't really know what is interesting or what is relevant unless you know the background behind it. So if you're just coming in blind, not knowing anything that's been done previously, you have really no context for what you're going to see scrolling across your screen, or what you are going to decide is like novel or interesting to you. So you have to know the background of literature. And fortunately for us, ultrasound literature is not that old. Like you could figure it out by just reading Dr. Gottlieb's systematic reviews in about an hour or so. So to acquaint yourself with the background, I think, is the first step, so that you can then recognize, hey, this really adds to what we didn't know yet, or this seems like incredibly novel. And then on top of recognizing when it's good methodology, you can figure out what studies are going to be interesting.
I think a lot of how we pick the articles is Mike tells us what we're going to be talking about that week. But I think the big thing when we go through them is this going to change anything? Is it going to enhance the quality of what I'm doing? And, you know, just because it's a good paper doesn't mean it's going to impact patient care. So that's always my, like, there's some really cool papers that you're like, yeah, but I would never do this. Like, this is just, and that's kind of, I think, what I typically add to the podcast is like, but are we going to really do this? And also, is it going to impact beyond our department? Because there's a lot of cool things you can do with ultrasound, but if only the emergency department's doing it, it's potentially delaying other patients' care, or, you know, it's an, I don't want to say a trick, but in the beginning it is. So how am I going to take this to that next level? And that's what I love doing the podcast is I like have a whole notebook of ideas from the papers, like whether we've liked them or not liked them, of like how I would do this different and better. And I really think that's where your research ideas come from is, you know, you don't have to just sit there and come up with this completely novel concept. Is like, well, this one has a score. Why doesn't this one have a score associated with it? This seems to be practical. Or like, why aren't we doing more of this ultrasound? Where's that gap? Like, this seems like it's really good. The sensitivity and specificity is there. Why isn't it happening? And that, like, from the papers to practice, seeing those gaps, I think is where new research is needed, right? Because we know it's a good ultrasound, but it's only being done by experts. Like, that's our least favorite paper, right? Because that's not 90% of emergency physicians. And what's happening at an academic institution compared to what's happening in a community institution is very different. So how do we bridge those gaps? And I think that's where showing time savings, showing patient cost savings, showing improved outcomes, and then taking that to the important people. So medical directors, hospital leadership, et cetera. And I think that's how you can apply the literature. I think when you're asking how to filter the mountain that is, I think you have to pick a couple trusted resources and stick with them that are in a form that's comfortable for you. So if you don't like podcasts, that's okay. If you set up your filters on PubMed to send you kind of updates weekly, you know, whatever works best for you, pick one, maybe two modalities to filter for you, and then stick with them. You don't have to do, I think that was a hard part in the beginning of any kind of academics, is there's all this foam and all these journals and all these everything, and you can't read all of them. So you have to pick a couple trusted resources and kind of stick with it, and then learn how to set up an effective way for yourself, whether it's filters or by email. So I think when things are in my email, I always read them. So that's how I like to get my modality. If it's in my house, I'll put it on a table, I'll move it around to like 6 different tables and eventually throw it away. I'm not going to read it that way. I just know myself. And so figuring out what works best for you, I think, is really crucial.
That's really helpful. I get a ton of FOMO when I'm like, I always just have Google Scholar alerts, but then I get all this FOMO where I'm like, I haven't looked at Twitter in like a couple days. I don't know what the biggest paper that everyone's talking about is. So that feels better. They don't have to look at Twitter all the time.
I was going to add on to what Cray was saying, because I 100% agree with it. And it sounds, well, the way I put it is you're trying to create your own like passive web. Like you want to create a web so that the big articles get stuck to it and then they get pushed to you passively, so that you don't have to go out searching for all these important things. So as much as possible, you want things pushed to you instead of you having to make time to go pull them manually. And so, like Craig said, you can set up PubMed searches or Google searches, Google Scholar searches, and have things go to you that way. Set up RSS feeds, follow your favorite people on social media, sign up for journal feed. Those things are all great because then it will funnel a lot of the important stuff to you very accessibly. And then on top of that, you add to that maybe regularly scheduled dives into the literature where you're like, you know, once a month, I'm just going to search for point of care ultrasound or emergency ultrasound, make sure I'm not missing any giant articles. And then lastly, I'll say just by being curious and following down clinical questions that you have, or following references when you don't understand something and continuing to look up stuff, you'll find a lot of great evidence and articles that way too.
Cool. Yeah, so once you've read the literature, you've asked some questions, you put it down in your idea notebook. The next step is really to start putting that project together. And I think that's somewhere, as I start to transition into like a faculty role, that's somewhere where someone comes to me with a project and says, I want to do this thing. And you're like, that's like a 10-year career development project, right? So like, how do you number one, select your scope, right? And number two, how do you mentor someone through that scope? And this is probably for anyone on this panel, but maybe I'll start with Dr. Lerner. So you started talking and we haven't heard from you in a while.
Yeah, so I spend most of my time kind of talking people through that. And I think the topic you just had, the first thing is really, when people come to you with an idea, the first question is, well, what do you know about what's out there before you get too far? But I think the other thing is it really depends on where you are, right? If you're trying to complete a project during your fellowship, then a 5-year longitudinal study is not what you want to be engaging in. And I think all of this, it's really important to know that you're never going to have a question that you're going to do one study to answer it. And that, if your big picture question is, how do I use ultrasound in this case, then you're going to pick through the little pieces till you get to that big answer. And I think that's the trick, right? Is to know how much time you have and to really allow yourself to find the path forward, which is usually a series of questions. And, if you're going to go on, especially if you're going to get NIH funding, they're going to expect you to have done things before you ask for that money. Nobody walks in with the $5 million randomized clinical trial and gets the money for it. They have put in many, many steps ahead. And so I think the first thing is to let yourself dummy it down to the pieces that you need to answer that big question, and to accept that you're going to do the little baby steps first. You're, a lit review to start, maybe a retrospective study to see what's there, and then prospective. And so I think it's just, the first thing to do is really to think about what are the pieces what can I achieve in the resources that I have, and to get your question to fit that.
Yeah, and being forgiving on yourself, it sounds like, for not doing the New England Journal paper right away.
Oh, always forgive yourself, and feel free to send it to New England Journal because they'll reject it in 24 hours. But but it's okay. And I think going back to the comment that Cray made about having fun, like, go have fun with it, and be very forgiving.
But that really dovetails well too on what Dr. Kia was saying about having those little steps and knowing where those gaps will be during your kind of march to the bigger stuff. One of the things you mentioned was industry sponsored trials. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that, because I think that there is a lot of opportunity to do and to partner with industry within ultrasound. There are a lot of interesting, new and exciting things that are coming out of that. And how do you go about that? How do you approach that group of people? And maybe we'll start with you and then go to somebody who's done that with an ultrasound as well.
I think the very first study we had was our research office emailed us. So our institution already does some industry related research, and I think that's a location. If your institution has a group of people who does contracts or is aware of sponsors who are interested in partnering with researchers at your institution, those are good people to go to if you're interested in getting started. That group of people emailed us, and I was the contact at that point, and that's how it got started. So my name got proliferated from there. So it becomes a lot easier once you do one, your name is out there. And then we have I can't seem to remember his name, that's out of Baylor. He does a lot of industry sponsored research and is a lead on many of these studies. And he knows my name, so he connects me with all of these studies as well. Yes, Frank Peacock. And so those are good people to connect with, especially if they know that you have done well in recruiting patients for those studies in the past. They will come back to you and ask you to do more of those studies. So I think that's a start. For some studies where it's not through like Frank or someone specific, and you're connecting directly with the sponsors, you can set up your own guidelines for the research. There's negotiation that is needed, such as, do you want to be able to save that data so that you can analyze it later and then write papers from it? Those are things you can set up in the contract with your legal team and their legal team, but you have to ask for that ahead of time. They're not just going to give you the data. And that's something I wanted for myself, so that way I could put that on my CV, right? So yeah, you want to be able to get something out of it, not just the funding. The funding for our institution still goes to our institution and then to the department. And then we've made some arrangements where a small part of that can be saved for my professional development account, which can be used for research as well as funding gaps. All of those things, again, need to be arranged ahead of time, because you don't want to go into the study and then say, oh, can I use this data? And it's like, well, it's not written in the contract, and they're all about the legal aspects of it. And the money went somewhere else already. You can't get that money back later. So you're working with industry and your institution, and they all have their own objectives. They don't have you usually as the priority. You have to think about yourself first to make sure it's moving your career ahead. And that's one of the things that I got taught from my mentor, because it's like, what are you going to gain out of doing these industry studies? So I had to figure that out for myself, that I wanted funding for future gaps, and I wanted to be able to put something down on my CV if that was a possibility. So for some of these COVID studies, they're too big. I knew I wasn't going to get the data, but I knew I was going to be able to do something to help with the pandemic. So that was my gain. And you have to figure out for yourself, what are you wanting from each of these studies, and how does it integrate with the rest of your research as well? So if you're doing something else that takes a lot more time, maybe you don't have the time for that industry study. But if it's like a small side project and you have the resources to do it, and it's not going to take you too much time from your bigger projects, I think that's an opportunity to, learn something new methodology, potentially new network of people, and potential funding or papers, if you figure out what you want from those studies.
Cool. Thank you. So really kind of knowing, again, where it fits into your overall career plan. We have about 10 minutes left. I wanted to hand it over if there are any questions in the chat. I know I saw one for Dr. Katini Shah about the ARMED program, and asking kind of what the best time to do it is, because the ultrasound fellowship year is really, it's a pretty packed year. You have to do a lot in one year. And what you found most useful about it, and what the best time, what the timing for that, what should be.
Yeah, sure. I actually think it would be really well positioned within your fellowship, because you're probably going to have more protected time during your fellowship than maybe your first year out, unless you have some grant funding to give you some buy down and some protection. So I think it's not too insane. It's a very nicely paced course that will kind of get your gears thinking about research, about projects, how to think about your research question, what kind of analysis. And you have content experts within EM across the country who are kind of giving these lectures. And even if you can't meet or attend them live, they're all recorded, so you can watch it on your own time. And then you have 2 sessions approximately, I think, where we get to meet in person and have like a intensive 2-day kind of workshop type thing. So I think it's very doable within fellowship.
Cool, thank you. If you have any other questions for our panelists, please throw them in the chat. And maybe what I will do is keep asking my own questions, since I have so many. I wonder if maybe, Dr. Gottlieb, you've spoken about this a lot before. What sets ultrasound apart from emergency medicine ultrasound, or emergency medicine research?
So yeah, I think there's a few things that make ultrasound a little bit unique when we're approaching it. One of which is that it has to be done largely, but not supposed to be in person. So it's a little bit different than some of the studies we can do. Can't really do ultrasound that well over the phone, barring tele-ultrasound. So it requires an in-person component to it. It requires trained users, right? There's a user dependency you have to account for. And that kind of hits twofold. Is one, you have to actually train up the people who are going to do ultrasounds. And one of the areas that comes up commonly in the literature is, that's great, you used PGY1s or 2s or 3s or fellows, but how were they trained to do this specific exam? So I think you have to be clear of like, how do we get that user to do this specific application so I can reproduce that? And then the other avenue is, there's a lot of studies of saying, here's our expert, but ultrasound fellows represent a smaller portion of our general population. And we're trying to get these skills out in the community. We're trying to get these skills in the broader EM community. It means we need to move beyond just how well can someone who's done 1,000 scans do this compared to the average user. And I think we need to sometimes approach these studies of, all right, we have our expert, we have our average user, we have our novice, and be able to study at these levels and break it down by that and account for some of these clustering effects and account for some of these differences in people training, and try to better understand how we can actually apply this in practice. As I said, a lot of ultrasound research sometimes gets treated as this more or less the ivory tower and how have we done it in this one fellowship program, but I need to know how you can apply this broadly so that it actually gets the uptake and the use at a much broader level.
Yeah. One of the other questions in the chat to that point of needing to have somebody there at the bedside was, how do you get your residents or all of the staff in your department to actually do the protocol that you're studying in its point of care application, especially within that point of care environment? For anyone.
I was going to say an important next step too that I think is missing in a lot of literature is outside of the academic setting, getting these applications. There's not a lot of the studies, even the multi-center studies, are still primary academic institutions with like some soft community sites that are still academic people with an interest in teaching and doing. And so I think I work at a true community site as well, and that's the hardest part, is seeing that huge gap and like the poor machine that I dust off every time I come in and put it back together. So I think that's just important, is that's I think where that next step for a lot of our research is how do we make this part of an everyday practice for more providers, both in the ED and in other environments. And that's a great area of opportunity for more fellows research in the future.
Yeah, and I think those are the kinds of things that are really like accessible during a fellow year, is those ultrasound education and ultrasound like flow, because there's so much data retrospectively that we have from whatever ultrasound storage solution we use, where you could see like who's doing the ultrasound, who's getting an ultrasound, like why are these group of people doing it? Is it because they just finished their like ultrasound rotation? Is it something else? So I think there are a lot of things there that can kind of be a baby step to setting us up to figuring that out. If there are no other specific questions, I want to thank all of our panelists. We're at the top of the hour. We will have another session on, I'm going to post it up here, if I can. There we go. Okay, so our next session is going to be August 12th. We're going to move the time up a little bit to help people on the East Coast who are trying to get out of work at 5 p.m. So we're going to move it up to 12 Pacific, 1 Mountain, 2 Central, and 3 Eastern. It'll be more of like lunch and post-lunch cortisol dump kind of time, where you could come in and talk about the next best thing in ultrasound research. Our next topic is going to be on the FAST. It'll be a true journal club this time, and we'll have at least one paper, which is the meta-analysis from the Cochrane group on point of care ultrasonography for diagnosing thoracoabdominal injuries in patients with blunt trauma. Thank you all so much.